Could you imagine being there? I mean, of all the places to be, all the different things we've taken pictures of, I think the most amazing picture would have been to be there that day. I've been at different places throughout the world and taken some pretty cool pictures of different things, but I'm certainly not a photographer. My wife takes way better pictures than I do. But when I look at all the different things I've been to, even if you've gotten to like the 7 wonders of the world or 8 wonders of the world or whatever, and you've been to all these like amazing sites, you take these kinds of pictures and you can look at the most amazing things you've been to or the amazing things you've done or the most amazing things that have been made, and you're like, wow, that's spectacular. Wow, that's awesome. Hey, look at that memory. Hey, that was great, the thing that we got to do. I would guess that the most amazing picture would have been that moment when Jesus was alive. Shortly after, just days after, you saw your friend being crucified. His life is over. You watched the whole thing. You're terrified. You're in tears. Your whole body, your everything is just shaken. And you saw it. And then just days later, all of a sudden, here's Jesus, your friend, alive. Could you imagine that moment? Now, for some, you're like, well, that's a great story, but I don't know that you can really believe that. I get it. We'll talk about that a little bit. But here's the reality of why this is such a special day. This is a special day because this is the day that we, for the last 2,000 and some years, have celebrated that Jesus is alive. Nothing has changed about that. It's been the same for the last 2,000 years. And here's what happened. In Luke chapter 24 is where we're going to spend our time today. Luke is a writer of what was going on in that day. And so we have that. We've had the same document for the last couple thousand years of what he wrote down for us to know as to what happened in that day. And here's where we get this whole he is risen indeed thing, okay? We get that from Luke chapter 24. When you go down to, and we'll get to this, these disciples, they went in and they got to this place together and they're hanging out and they came in excited and they said, he's risen. And the response was, he is risen indeed. And what we're going to say today is what? Like, that's so weak. Hey, Jesus is alive. All right, kids. You got to help your parents and your friends and everybody around you out because, like, we're like, we need 3 more cups of coffee or something. I don't know. Kids, you got to help me out here. Don't scream, but I want you to let it be a little louder than normal. You're out in the playground. Ready? So I'm going to say, he is risen. You're going to say what? Jesus is alive. Just the kids, all right? Was that just the kids? All right, I don't think I heard the kids in the back. So ready? He is risen. That's pretty good. Now, can we get the adults like, I know, we're mature. You know, we dressed really nice. We're dignified. You know, we would just say, Jesus is alive. Can we try this a little bit together? You ready? He is risen. Jesus is alive. Okay, my expectation for the next 20, 25 minutes is that every time I say he is risen, you will respond out loud in the middle of my preaching with, Jesus. Now listen, I saw a whole bunch of adults that weren't doing anything. Your mouths were not moving. Come on now. So if you see someone that their mouth is not moving, you feel free to give them a little holy nudge. Here's the reality. I wish I were there that day, and I think you would be as well, to be able to see your friend, to see Jesus, who you walked around with. You saw him do crazy miracles and all kinds of awesome things in life, and to be seeing him crucified and dead and in the tomb, then to see him 3 days later alive. All of us would collectively say, I would wish that I could have been there on that day. In Luke chapter 24, let me go through this, and Matt did a great job with the kids in the beginning here, and he didn't know what I was going to be preaching on, but we're on the same text, which is really cool how God worked all that out. But in Luke chapter 24, verses 1 through 12, you find the ladies, not the men. The men kind of hung back. They weren't doing anything but doing whatever, sleeping in or something. But the ladies, they go to the tomb where Jesus was buried, and they go for the purpose of embalming, or for the purpose of bringing just the rites, in a sense, of to that death to him. And so they go to where he's at, and they see that the stone is rolled away from the front of the tomb. And so they have the opportunity to go in. And so when they go in, they expect to see this body that they saw when they wrapped him up to put him in there. They expected to see the same exact thing. So they go in looking for that, and they see nothing. No body. But then when they begin to digest this a little bit, an angel appears to them and says to them, "He is not here. He's risen." Right? And so they say that back to him, and it's just as he said, is what they say. Well, they're in a bit of a fog in their mind, not sure what's going on, because this has never happened before. This was not what they expected. It's a little bit weird. It's even kind of weird to talk about it in church even, right? For some of you, you're like, yeah, this is a funny kind of a conversation to have, that he is risen. Right? And so there's this difficulty for some of you, and I get that. And they struggle too. So here's what they do, and you find in verse 11, it says, "But these words seemed like an idle tale." Really? You're telling me that Jesus is alive? It seemed like weird. They made it up. And so here's what happened. What happened is, see, there's going to be conversations that just happen randomly here, and that's all good. Those that are watching online, you're missing the fun. So here's the reality. They tell the disciples, and the disciples, the closest friends, they are looking at this and they're like, "This is kind of weird. I don't know what you're talking about." And Peter and John, they go running back to the tomb to be able to identify this, and they see that, okay, Jesus' body's not there. They see the wrapped linen over on a pile here, and this kind of weird, and they don't know what to do, so they literally just kind of go back home. They don't know what to do. And so they're just kind of in this fog, if you will. Verse 13, the story continues, and it says, "On that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem." So they're walking 7 miles. 7 miles from here is about what? Going to Berlin, up to Mount Laurel somewhere, Moorestown, down past Deptford, maybe Pittman, I don't know. But think about 7 miles. Go for a walk for 7 miles. Anybody into that? No? Okay. There's a lot of people who are like, "No, that's not my thing at all." Okay, so they're walking 7 miles to go from Jerusalem. Everybody say Jerusalem. And they're going to Emmaus. Okay, good. So you're with me. So they're walking Jerusalem to Emmaus, and how far away is that? Okay, just a little bit of a walk. So they're walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and while they're walking, they're talking about the things that are going on, the things that had just happened, because it's literally only been 3 days, and they're a little bit like struggling. Wouldn't you be? Think about the disciples and what they were going through. They watched their leader, their teacher, just be crucified in front of them, and now they had to really process this and wonder, am I going to be next? Are they coming after me? They'd be terrified to be seen in public. They'd be nervous about the whole thing, and they wouldn't have Jesus to go back and talk to. So while they're doing this, they're walking through, and they're having this conversation together, and then Jesus comes up and begins to talk to them. They have no idea it's Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is different than the way that he looked before. If Thomas, and we'll get to this, saw the nail prints in his hands and such, and they could see the physical disfiguration that happened as a result of all the beatings and the crucifixion, then I would imagine that seeing him in this form would be different, because it says that he was hardly recognizable on the cross. Now, they're having this conversation with him, and Jesus says to them, "Hey guys, what's going on?" And they respond to Jesus. They say, "Have you been living under a rock or what, dude? Like, seriously, in Jerusalem, there's one thing everybody's talking about. Hey, this week, what's one of the big things that got talked about this week? Yeah, bridge, right? Big news. We all know about it. And when you think about this, in that day, without the internet and without all the things, everybody knew that Jesus was crucified. This was a massive thing that happened. This one that healed thousands of people, this one that had performed miracles and fed people and all kinds of amazing things that you'd look and say, man, he's the greatest guy ever. Now he's crucified. And there was a big mob crowd of them that wanted him crucified. And everybody's like, wow, this is really weird. And so Jesus is saying, hey, what are you talking about? What's going on? And they're like, you must have missed something. So they begin to just say of all the different things that have happened. In verse 19, he said to them, what things? Jesus says that, and they said to him, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who's a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. And verse 21 gives you a picture of their heart, right? So here's what the disciples, the closest friends of Jesus, said in verse 21. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. We hoped. Man, we were with Jesus. We hoped that he was the one. So they go a little bit further, and they're talking about this and how the ladies went down to the tomb and found it empty, and the angels appeared, and all this weirdness, and they're like just confused. And Jesus says back to him in verse 25, he said, now, do you remember what they thought of Jesus? They thought, where have you been? You've been living under a rock. You're like dumb, right? Jesus' response in verse 25 is great. He says, "O foolish ones." He turns it right back around on them. You think I'm dumb for not knowing what's going on. O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? Now, Christ is not Jesus' last name. Do you know that? It's not Jesus' first name, Christ last name. Christ is a description of who Jesus is, and that Christ actually means the Messiah. So the Messiah is one that's predicted for thousands of years previous, saying this Messiah, this chosen one, is going to come. So when we say Jesus Christ, we're literally saying Jesus, the chosen one, Jesus, the Messiah. Not Jesus, and his last name is Christ, okay? So he's saying, some of you are like, wow, I didn't know that. I won't ask for a raise of hands, but you had to get to learn something new today. And so he's saying it was necessary that Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory. It was necessary. This suffering had to happen. It wasn't a mistake. God wasn't like, stink, I fell asleep, I took a nap at the wrong time, and Jesus got crucified. No, that wasn't the deal. Matter of fact, when you look through the prophets and what they said in the Old Testament, Isaiah 53 is a great one, and there's several others as well where it points out that in the future this Messiah will suffer greatly. And so he did. And so he goes through from, in verse 27, in beginning in Moses, so the beginning of the Bible, all the way through the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures that he had concerning himself. So they come to this village where they were going. They get to this place, Emmaus, and they're going in to kind of hang out and have food together. And so they go in, and Jesus acted like he was going further, and they said, hey, why don't you stay? It's kind of getting late. Why don't you stay and hang out? Let's have some food together. And so they urged him strongly, and so he goes in with them. Now, verse 30 is so great. Verse 30 says, when he was at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. It looks just like what happened a few days before that week. Looks just like the Last Supper where he's hanging out with them and he breaks the bread and he blesses it. And in that moment they realize this man that we're talking to is Jesus. And they look at him and they realize, oh, there he is. That's Jesus. How incredible. And just as he does that, Jesus then departs. So there's the beginning picture of this, and then what happens from there is these two disciples, they hightail it from Emmaus back to Jerusalem, which is how far away? And here's what they do. They run from Emmaus. Now, this was not the slow track. This was like, hey, we're hoofing it. We're getting over there. They run from Emmaus all the way back over to Jerusalem. And here's what they do. They run into where the disciples are hanging out. And they say to them, "He's risen!" And they respond, "Jesus is alive!" Because they were getting it. They were beginning to get that. And Luke then records that after that moment, Jesus enters into the room to hang out with them, and they all get to have this conversation with Jesus. How cool is that? Now, here's the reality. The reality is, all of the disciples are left with some heartbreak. And I want to touch in on that just for a couple minutes. Let me highlight 3 disciples, and then I'll put them all together. Peter. I would imagine that Peter felt like a failure. Realizing that Jesus is alive, he was a failure because he realized the conversation that he had with Jesus right before Jesus was crucified. He realized the conversation with him was Jesus saying, "Hey, Peter, you're going to be denying me 3 times. You're going to act like you don't even know me, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Peter's like, "That's never going to happen. You kidding me? I would die for you." And what happens? A few hours later, somebody comes up and says, "Hey, you know that Jesus that's over there getting beaten and he's about to be crucified? You were friends with him, right?" And what does Peter say? "I never knew that guy. Come on now." And then a little girl comes and says that to him. "Hey, mister, did you know that guy?" I never met him before. 3 times Peter said that. He denied Jesus. Listen, in the worst hour of Jesus' life for them, Peter, I would imagine, felt like a total failure. That he wanted to go through this whole thing and not deny Jesus. And I would imagine he felt like a failure in that moment. But here's what we understand very quickly. We get that because of what Jesus did, Jesus offers forgiveness for all the things that we failed at. That only happens because Jesus, he is risen. That was so weak. Come on. I know, it was like a little trick. I paused a little bit. I was seeing if you were paying attention, because I was trying to say, he is risen. All right, that's better. And here's what we understand. Through Jesus, through him, we have grace and forgiveness of sins. And Peter would have to go back to that. And he has a conversation with Jesus about this. It's through what Jesus has done. Jesus didn't die and rise again so that he could start a religion. That was not the purpose. It wasn't to say, "Hey, you should be good like me as well." Jesus did all of this so that he could pay for our sin, so we could have life with him for all eternity. So Peter felt like a failure, and then he had to realize and go back to consistently that Jesus Christ is risen. Good. The second one, real quick, Thomas. Thomas is great because in John chapter 14, Thomas is having a conversation with him, and you follow him through, and you see what's going on with Thomas. And after Jesus dies and he rises again, they're in this room talking about Jesus and the fact that he is risen. Right? And they're all talking about this, and they're trying to convince him that Jesus is alive. And here's what Thomas does. He says in the Gospel of John, John records it for him. He goes, guys, listen. I will never believe this. It's a hoax. It's stupid. That doesn't happen. There's no way. You guys are ridiculous. I will never believe that. Unless if Jesus shows up in front of me, puts his hands out and lets me touch the hands where the nails went through. I watched him. I know he was dead. There's no way he's alive. And you can kind of hear the heart of Thomas as he's saying this. He's not a little bit like, yeah, I'm not going to believe. No, he's mad. He's angry. It's like they're playing with him is how he feels. All hope is lost, and Thomas is just struggling. He's like, I can't even go there. And here's what happens 8 days after that. The Gospel of John records. 8 days later, the disciples are hanging out again as friends, and Jesus comes walking in the room. And he goes right up to Thomas, face to face, and he says, "Hey, Thomas, here you go, buddy. Feel free. I'm here." And then I would imagine Peter in the background said, "See, I told you, he is risen." Yeah, you got it. And the rest of the disciples did exactly that. They're like, "Hey, Thomas, I told you, Jesus is alive, na 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 na," right? And how does Thomas feel for the days that follow that? Thomas is like, "Oh, I'm so dumb. He did tell us. I should have believed. What's wrong with me?" Jesus would never want to have any part of me. And that's when he would have to be reminded about the resurrection and what it truly meant. Thomas would have to grab onto the whole reality that it's not about whether you're smart enough and you believe everything all in that moment. The reality is that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is to bring hope to those that fail, to bring hope to those that didn't get it, to bring hope to those that are struggling, to bring hope to those that are confused and hurt and angry, so that Thomas could say to others then, "He is risen." Jesus is alive. All right, one more, John. John regretted a whole lot of things, I believe, and this would be a little bit speculative as I read through the Gospel of John and who he is. John was a best friend of Jesus. And John was one that was there for all the different things that are going on. And Jesus talks to John while Jesus is on the cross, which is really fascinating. And here's what happens. I believe John regretted saying and doing nothing. You ever watch somebody go through a really bad moment and you didn't do anything to help them? You ever watch somebody get bullied and you weren't there to help them not get bullied? I believe John regretted saying and doing nothing. He refers to himself as the disciple that Jesus loved. He referred to himself in that sense of, I was best buds with Jesus. He was everything to me. But as Jesus carried the cross up, and he couldn't carry it anymore because his body just couldn't carry it anymore up the hill, they grabbed a stranger and said, "Hey, you help carry it." I would imagine if I were John and you would do the same thing, if that was your best friend that was carrying the cross, wouldn't you have a regret saying, I wish that when I saw him fall down, that instead of me being afraid and hiding in the crowd, I would have gone up to Jesus and said, "I'll carry it with you." And I would imagine that as John's right there at the cross, one of the only ones that Jesus speaks to on the cross, I would imagine that while he's there, he doesn't do anything as a friend to comfort him. He just sits there. And Jesus looks at him and says, in my own words, "John, take care of my mom." And John didn't have anything back. I would imagine he regretted saying and doing nothing. But here's the reality. We understand and we get the picture that this is not about what all the disciples didn't do, and things that they did wrong. We understand that Jesus will never leave us or forsake us. We understand that Jesus is always there. Why? Because he is risen. Wow, you're getting tired. I don't imagine the disciples got tired of saying that, do you? I would imagine if they saw this face to face and everything, I would imagine they never got tired of saying this, right? All the disciples, and you can see this through the picture, through all the things that are written about this time, they lost faith when they needed it the most. In Luke 24:21, I read this already. It says, "But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." We hoped this. He was everything they expected, but now he's dead. He was supposed to be Israel's redeemer, but now he's dead. And it's been 3 days, and they've lost everything. They've lost all their hope. Can I just say that I meet a lot of people that as a kid they believed in Jesus. Or as an adult, there was a time that they believed in Jesus, that they got it, and they could understand that Jesus, he's risen.
Jesus is alive.
Like they get it and they understand. But here's what I know. That somebody at some point in time caused enough questions that they didn't know how to answer. Or life kind of went sour. And they prayed and, well, if Jesus is alive, why didn't he answer my prayer? Where's he at? And they concluded that's just some old fable, some tale about this guy a long time ago, and they made it up and all these different things, and they kind of put it in that box, a category, and they leave it as a bunch of question marks. And what are you supposed to do with it anyway? And here's my encouragement. If that's you, or if you know somebody that's like that, Jesus isn't just a decent person. He was. Not just a moral person that lived in that day. He wasn't somebody to be a hero. No, Jesus was truly the Son of God. Why do I believe in that? I believe in that because what we see is we see all these best friends of Jesus that talk about this, that describe that Jesus, he's alive. Yeah. He is risen. Now, the funny thing is, his own brother said that as well. And then there's hundreds of other people that said the same thing as well. So you have all these people in that day that describe Jesus as being alive. And to be honest with you, this was if you want to get away with something, this was the worst way to do it. Because Jesus is doing this in front of, thousands and thousands of people, in front of everybody. Everyone knew that Jesus had been crucified. Everybody knew it. It wasn't just this little hoax that you kind of hide and, oh yeah, I think he died, and oh, then he's alive. No, it wasn't that. It's that everybody saw it. It's the center of everything that's going on in Jerusalem. So you couldn't pull this off in front of the Roman guards. You couldn't pull this off in front of the town or the neighborhood because everybody knew, everybody saw it, and the government, they knew how to make people die. They were good at this, masters of it at that day. So there's no hoax here. And for hundreds of people to come out at that same time saying, oh no, he is truly risen. Then here's the reality of that statement. The reality is, as they walk through this, they would have to then back that story up, because in the next few years, their own lives would be at stake, because they were putting to death anybody that would say this. Lazarus be one. They chased him, and the disciples all gave their lives for this. Why would they do that if it's just a story that was made up? Why would they steer somebody wrong? That doesn't make any sense. And so we have this document that's in front of us that's been preserved, and it's the same for the last 2,000 years to identify and confirm in us that Jesus truly, he is risen. So no matter what your past looks like, and no matter where you're at right now, no matter where your doubts are, no matter what's happening right in this moment, I just want to encourage you to begin your journey toward him. It literally starts with the resurrection. That's where this journey begins. We can debate a whole lot of things that are written in this text, and we can work through a whole lot of things, but the one thing that can't be debated is the resurrection. This week I was out. I decided I want to buy a new cell phone this week, and so I went to the place I was going to buy this, and I went a couple weeks ago to start to look at the cell phone thing, and I wasn't sure which one. I'm not big into technology and getting all the new and latest and greatest. It's just that mine is messing up on me, and I need to update it, and it's like a bunch of years old. And so I'm talking to this guy, and it's just me and him in this store and nobody else. So he's working through all the paperwork, and you know how that goes, and asking some questions, and we're having this conversation like I do with everybody I talk to. I like people. So we're talking, and he says, well, what do you do? And I'm beginning to describe what I do and different things and I get involved in, and we begin to talk about Jesus. Well, that's my favorite topic. Look, I can talk about cars, that's all right, but Jesus is my favorite topic. There's nothing better, all right? And so we start talking about Jesus, come to find out he's Muslim. And so I'm having this conversation. He's really a super nice guy, and from Turkey. And so we're talking about being a Muslim and Christianity and the differences and the distinctions. And I was able to just kind of talk this through. And he was super receptive and super, like, very smart person. And talking back and forth about this. And I was just sharing with him. I said, listen, the biggest thing, the biggest difference is the resurrection. See, I celebrate that Jesus, he is risen. It said, you'll look at Jesus and you'll say he's just a good person. He's like a prophet and such. But I understand it's totally different because I understand Jesus is still alive. And the conversation continued. He says back to me, he says, man, you're right. I don't believe that he's risen. There's no way. I really struggle with that whole thing. I said, I get it. That is the biggest thing to get through, the largest hurdle of all things. It's easy to get involved with a religion. It's easy to have kind of a crutch of people that have the same feels about God as you do. But to walk through this and understand that this person was crucified and that this person rose again, and to place your faith in this one thing, that's massive. The disciples struggled with it, and so we will also. And I would imagine in life there's going to be times where we kind of go back and forth and say, man, is this real? And we have to go back and reconfirm and say, okay, I want to make sure. And so we study the history behind it. We study how everything happened, and we try to even, I've known people that say, I want to push against this. I want to prove it wrong. If you come to an understanding that Jesus, he is risen, then what happens is in Luke chapter 24, it talks about this. It says he must suffer so that we can come to repentance and we can come to understanding him and salvation. And so what that looks like is I'm changing my directions from being against or just kind of having Jesus as my good luck charm to instead my faith is fully in Jesus, and out of him everything flows. He is my only hope. He's everything that I have. So that if you have faith in Jesus, then guess what? At the moment that you die and leave this planet, you get to live forever in eternity with him because Jesus has paid for all of the things that would separate you from God. You can't outwork your way, because if you try to outwork your way, you're missing something. What do you do with all the things you did wrong? You can't, listen, there's no amount of good you can do to do wrong, right? We know that. That's logical. And in God's economy, it's the same. And so what God's done is said, I am sending Jesus to die on the cross, to pay for all of the things that you've done against me, all of the wrong, even though you've done a whole lot of good things. I'm having him pay for all the wrong things so that when you place your faith in Jesus, the one who died and the one who is alive, your life is different. And so, listen, you're here to hear about this, to be reminded. Why do I preach an Easter sermon every Easter? Well, because I think we need to be reminded. Because there's a lot of questions and doubts and struggles. And maybe it's your first time really thinking this through. Regardless of where you're at, my point is to pull us back to the one thing that means the most. It's his resurrection. And if today this is your first day that you say, I need to come to faith in Jesus, we'd love for you to do that. You don't have to give money to the church. It's as simple as saying, Lord Jesus, I believe that you are alive. Lord, work in me. Let's bow our heads together. Lord, it's been good to be together and to talk about you and what you've done. Lord, it's so great to know that you are our hope. You are the reason for our living. And Lord, as we process all of this, I pray that you be with those that are questioning and beginning to think that maybe it's time to accept you. Lord, some that are confused even. And those that, Lord, have accepted you a long time ago, Lord, I just pray that you would bring us all close to you. Help us to walk by faith and not by sight. Lord, we want to give you the praise for all that you are doing. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.